Hi, I'm Kristi Northup, and I am the executive pastor at Saints Community Church in New Orleans, Louisiana. And we are going to do our second video on renovations. This one is about the differences between using professionals and volunteers. Some pros and cons, some basic definitions to help you really decide which is the best way to go. We have generally used a combination of professionals, contractors, and our volunteers, and we have found that we've really gotten a big bang for our buck doing that. So let's just start with a few basic definitions. So for starters, let's talk about what is a general contractor. People say this term, a lot of people call things a general contractor that's not necessarily a general contractor. A general contractor is the one overarching over the entire project that hires the subs. So they hire the subcontractors, the plumbers, the AC people, the flooring people, but they coordinate the entire project. They create the sequence, which is incredibly important to have the right sequence of things going in so that you don't put in a wall that then you have to tear into because you didn't get your permit inspection for your plumbing and then you have to redo the sheetrock. So a general contractor oversees all of that. The way that a general contractor makes their money is a couple ways. They make their money on the markup between the wholesale prices that they get and the retail prices that you would probably pay anyway. And then they also do usually a certain percentage of markup on top of what they pay the subs. So you don't pay the subs, you pay the general contractor, and they pay these other people that work for them on a contracted basis, and they do a markup, and then sometimes they do a percentage, a flat percentage on top of that. That's how they make their money. Subcontractors. So we talked about this a little bit already. A sub is someone who does one specific area. They do plumbing installation, or they might do plumbing under the house, or they might do cabinet installation, flooring installation, or they might be the finisher. So the people who install the doors are different than the people who install the trim, who are different than the people who do the painting. This is why it's a long process that requires a lot of sequencing, because if something has to go back and you have to go back to another sub, then you lose time there. So it's important to understand that subcontractors don't do everything. They do one thing and then someone else comes in and does the next piece. The next definition would be just professionals or vendors. So this would be like, if you don't want to do it all through the general contractor, but you want to do some of your own general contracting, which is what I've done a few times, and get separate bids on a different piece. We've used separate vendors for air conditioning, which I usually refer to as HVAC or AC. And so that would be like your kind of your professionals and your vendors that supply certain things, or maybe they're your vendor for church chairs, or they're your vendor for kids furniture. So those are like kind of what your vendors do, and they usually have their own subcontractors that they either hire or they work in-house and they do their installation. So if you decide that you want to piece out the general contracting, maybe you're gonna do these projects with the general contractor, but these you're gonna price out yourself and see if you can beat the price. There's a few thoughts on that. I encourage you to get multiple estimates. Don't just go to one place, because each place you go, you get a little more information, you get a better idea. We usually try to do 3. That's not hard and fast. When we just did our roof, we actually did 6 estimates, because what they were saying was so radically different that we felt like we couldn't really get a handle on it, and we just decided we're not gonna get in a hurry. We're gonna wait till we get the right information and the right price. It wasn't actually the lowest price, but we felt like it was the right fit for what we needed. We've done that as well for sound and lighting. But we kept the big stuff, the big things that happen in the walls, all that has been done by the general contractor. The other thing to know is that if you're going to do some of your own contracting, you need to understand the pieces that go into that. So it's basically supplies and labor. And a rule of thumb across the board in construction is generally you can figure whatever you're spending on supplies. So if you're spending $5,000 on flooring, it's gonna cost about $5,000 for the labor to install it. So it's not a $5,000 job, it's a $10,000 job. So you can see why it's so tempting to do it yourself, because you save so much on labor, but sometimes it's not really worth it. Within supplies, something that I've learned the hard way is that you usually have to account for shipping. That can be right now with the outrageous prices of gas and COVID and all of that stuff. Shipping is like 20% of what we're paying total. Then you've also got other little supplies that if you try to piece all of that out yourself and not use a professional to at least do the order, you're not necessarily gonna know, like glue for the carpet, like little lugs and nuts and bolts, and like for the AC, I didn't want to order all the AC parts myself. I used an AC contractor who ordered everything because he understands what he's gonna miss. And as much as I would like to save the money, I would actually end up spending more money if I tried to order all of that stuff myself. So you do want to use the professionals, have them help you, assist you on the ordering end, or have them do the ordering, because ultimately that's gonna save you because they're gonna know what they're not missing. So that's a little bit about like the full estimates you need to understand. It's the supplies, the little extra pieces for install, and then the labor on top of it. So what are the pros to working with a contractor? And when I say contractor, I'm meaning really mostly a general contractor, but really with any contractor. First pro is that this is the price. Like, they give it to you in a written estimate. Any contractor that doesn't want to give you a written estimate is not a contractor. That's what you call a handyman, because a contractor will give you a written price. They're not billed out by the hour, like, oh, we worked 8 hours today, so pay us now. No, a contractor figures in all of their labor, and that's where they make their money, is trying to shave off a little on the time. So this is the price, and even better, this is the time. So it's like, here's the timeline. We think we can do this in 3 weeks, or we can do this in 6 weeks. So it's like, it takes less time than what it would be with volunteers. The third thing is that they deal with the problems so that you don't have to. So if there's something you don't like with the AC, like we had a thing where something didn't have a cover and my husband felt nervous about it. Did I talk to the AC guy? No, I called the general contractor. The other thing is that it should be done correctly. If you're doing it with the general contractor and they are licensed and insured, they're gonna know how to do it, and it's gonna be done correctly, which you want, because you're spending a lot of money. Lastly, this is probably my husband's favorite part, they clean up. Contractors have people that follow them all day long and clean up their messes, so when they leave at night, it's not a big mess. And then when the job is done, they hire people to actually come in and clean the space. That should all be part of the estimate. It's beautiful. So those are the pros. Okay, what are the cons to working with a general contractor? The first one is pretty obvious. It can be extremely expensive. It can be multiple times over more expensive than it would be to just do it with volunteers. The second con that I can think of is that sometimes it's really hard to finish the last 10%. Now, all of us know it's always hard to finish the last 10%. But what happens is, remember that sequence I talked about? If they get out of the sequence and then they go work on another job, then it might be several weeks or even several months before they can get them back to finish out those last little finishing details or correct a little problem. The last thing that, and I'm sure there's other cons and other pros, but from what I can think of and in my experience, to be honest, it's a little intimidating to deal with contractors on like questions and negotiating prices, because they know, and I don't know as well as they know. But I just have learned to humble myself and ask a lot of questions, and I've also learned to just be firm and be tough and not be afraid to give them pushback when I really think something isn't quite right. So those would be the drawbacks. You gotta have a little grit, and you gotta be willing to work as a team, but those would be some of the cons. So my main tips for working with contractors would be, number one, take the time in the beginning to work out exactly what the project is gonna look like. If they're a good contractor, they are strong on the front end. They want to get all the details, all the colors, figure out from the beginning what the scope of this is gonna be. So you go around together, usually it takes multiple visits, usually at least 3. They come, then they bring their subs, they look at it again, we sit down again, they send me an estimate, we review it again, maybe we walk through again. So it's not just the pricing, it's the scope of the project. Take the time on the front end to really get a good idea, because otherwise you're taking the time in the middle, and that's a lot more awkward. That's a lot more difficult. It's just better to just take the time on the front end to really get the details worked out. The second thing is, I had said this before, but get a written estimate of what this is gonna cost. Now, that's not to say that there aren't sometimes other things that come up, but it shouldn't be like stuff that was in the scope. My third thing is, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to negotiate price. I already talked about that a little earlier. And on the pricing, FYI, contractors typically get paid half up front, and then maybe either they do a series of payments to the end or the rest is at the end. When they are contracted labor that's coming out for like a couple hours, it is like they hand you an estimate or they hand you an invoice and it is due immediately. So don't start a project that you don't have the cash on hand to finish. You have to pay them like that day or by the end of that week. But when you're using like an actual contractor estimate, they get paid half up front and half at the end, more or less. The last little tip is, just so you know, contractors start at like 6 or 7 a.m. on Monday morning. So the hardest part about working with both contractors and volunteers is that I literally work 7 days a week until that project is done, because my volunteers are working on the weekends, my contractors are in at 7 o'clock on my day off on Monday. So they start early and they're there on time, and they usually finish kind of early, like 3:30, 4 o'clock. So that's my tips about working with contractors. So all of you have worked extensively with volunteers. I don't need to explain to you what a volunteer is or how to work with a volunteer. But let's talk a little bit about the pros and the cons of working with volunteers in a renovation. One of them is obvious. Hopefully you save an enormous amount of money. That would be the goal. That would be the number one reason why you want to use volunteers. Another reason is because it is a great way for your team to bond. When we did our first renovation on our first building, it was 8,000 square feet. I'm not exaggerating, we had 100% participation from our adults and students. It was amazing. People were bringing friends. It was so fun, it was so bonding. And so then that also creates such a high level of buy-in, because when people are like, I laid that tile, I painted that wall, it's like, it's so special, and there's just a level of buy-in that, I mean, even in the Old Testament it talks about how, you know, all of the specialty guys did their crafting. And so it's a really special thing when your volunteers can come together and do a project together. The other thing that's kind of along the lines of saving a lot of money, but it's like, you can stretch the budget. So it's like, if you have 100,000 to work with, you can probably do 2 to 3 times as much with volunteers as you can do with general contractors. Let's talk a little bit about the cons. So the biggest con with working with volunteers is that sometimes if you have people doing work that they really don't know how to do, it can actually end up costing a lot more money than it would have if you had used a general contractor. The other place that you get overages is that it's like, you don't have that like super detailed written out, this is the cost. You're just kind of buying supplies as you go, and you just can have really high overages just because of the stress and the time and the necessity of like, oh wait, we didn't know we needed lugs for that. We gotta run back to Home Depot again. So it's like, there's just a lot of buying back and forth, and you're just kind of hemorrhaging money because you're too far in to stop. So those are some of the cons. Another huge con for working with volunteers is it can take a lot longer to finish than you thought it was going to. Sometimes you have great momentum in the beginning, but then it wears on 2, 3, 6 months, a year, and you've got the same 2 or 3 people showing up, gutting it out with a bad attitude every weekend. So that's what you don't want to have. Because obviously that leads to my last con, which is that it can create burnout, especially in you if you are the leader, because you feel like you always have to be there. So it's like a really delicate balance. So I have a couple things that I'm going to recommend to try to mitigate that and ways that we can work together. The first tip I would give you on using volunteers to help with your renovation is do it in short projects. So I would not recommend, we did this. We tried to use volunteers to move a bathroom. We had a small women's bathroom with 2 stalls and we wanted a larger women's bathroom with 3 stalls. It was horrible. Our guys are in there with jackhammers for weeks trying to get through concrete and everybody's sick of it and then there's just a big hole in the floor. Don't do it. Don't do that type of project for volunteers. I'll use volunteers for things like cleaning out, organizing. So like 2 days a year, we have a big volunteer day where we have people come and we like clean out closets, clean out a building, move things over. So that type of thing I'll use them for. Or short projects like I've had guys that came and put in the trim. Like they were able to do the finishing and we have a finishing gun and they did the finishing. They did it in like a Saturday morning or maybe 2, or maybe they built the sub stage for the stage. That was like a week-long project. No volunteer projects that are more than like 2 weeks long because it'll take 2 years. So keep it short. Number 2, keep it simple. You want to keep it within the scope of what people are able to do. The one professional thing that I have used volunteers for quite a bit is painting, because you don't want to just use anybody to paint. But if you have people who are really good at painting and they enjoy it, I have like 4 or 5 kind of go-to volunteer painters. And then we have someone who is a professional painter in another state who's been really supportive of our church. And he came and painted our ceiling. That was a beast of a job. So he came for like 2 weeks and we were able to use volunteer labor to do that. But that was a specific project for a specific amount of time that was within the specific skill set of those volunteers. Third, you want skilled projects for skilled laborers. So what you don't want is you don't want someone who's got a wonderful Christian heart to lay the tile who's never laid tile. If someone is a professional tile person and they want to volunteer their skill to lay tile, then that's great. But you got to keep them within the project. So keep it simple, keep it short, keep it within their skill. Number 4, this is so important, is the sequence. You have to think through the sequence. If you don't have the ability to do that, you have to have some people who know and understand construction help you figure out the sequence. Otherwise, you're going back and spending more money and more effort to redo things that should have been done in a different order. Number 5, seek advice. Don't think that you can just figure it out on your own, or even YouTube, it's great, but seek advice from people who know, who have expertise in different areas. Proverbs says, a king wages war among many advisors. So get some advisors, get a team of people, have people that kind of help you make those decisions. And last, stay honest with yourself about your limitations. Try to be honest up front, but if you get in too deep and you're like, yeah, no, we can't finish this. We had a back door in a house that we were trying to put in a sliding door and we just could not figure something out. I picked up the phone, I called the contractor, said, we're gonna add this to the bid. So stay honest with yourself. Listen, I think renovations are the most fun thing that we do in church. You're gonna have a great time. If you just, have an order, you have people to help you, you're gonna have a great time. You're gonna bond with your people, doing renovations together, cleaning stuff out together, working with your contractors. We've seen some of those guys get saved, baptized in the Holy Spirit, come to our church, be part of it. It's gonna be great. Enjoy it every step of the way, and when it is done, you're never gonna be happier.